BioCentury this week is brought to you by CBRE, the global leader in commercial real estate services, with a specialized practice dedicated exclusively to life sciences. From early-stage biotechs to established companies scaling biomanufacturing operations, CBRE's life sciences experts help companies find, build, and optimize spaces where discovery happens. With deep market intelligence across the nation's innovation clusters, top-notch facilities, and a network of investors and tenants, CBRE has what it takes to help you succeed. This blend of knowledge and relationships ensures you receive the best advice at every stage, so you can focus on bringing therapies to patients.
One of the UK biotech scene's best assets, Patrick Vallance, is out as Minister of State for Science, Research and Innovation, as Andy Burnham becomes UK Prime Minister. We'll discuss what the latest body blow for UK biotech means on the BioCentury This Week podcast. I'm Jeff Cranmer, executive editor here. Joining me today, Editor-in-Chief Simone Fishburne, Executive Editor Selena Koch, and Washington Editor Steve Usden. I'm just back from BioAsia Taiwan in Taipei, and will share my thoughts on biotech at max heat, humidity, and Xiaolongbao. Plus, Biogen's phase 3 bet on its anti-tau therapy gets complicated, and a psychedelic buy from Eli Lilly. We'll also check in on what's happening at FDA. All right, Simone, your phone has been blowing up this morning as the government begins to take shape in your motherland. What are you learning?
Right. So I assume you are talking about the new prime minister and not the football team, right?
Where I wasn't going to go there, but
I got to tell you, there's a lot of people on my phone who seem to think England actually won and that the other game was just some playoff. So there we go.
Most exciting consolation match in history?
It was a great match. Anyway, what's not so great? Well, at least for biotech. So there were, a new Burnham government. Obviously, everybody across the UK is like, what does this mean? Blah, blah, blah. And the biotech sector cares about two things. And it got a little bit of a win and quite a loss, but we'll see how it plays out. So the little bit of the win is on the announcement of the Chancellor, who will be John Healey, right? And at this point, the main thing we know about John Healey is that he's not Ed Miliband. The point being that when I spoke to people, they were really pretty concerned about Ed Miliband. These are business leaders. They felt his policies were a little bit left-wing for them. But more than that he would be so focused on net zero that it would take away investment and so on in life sciences. So I think that on that front, people will be reassured. And the reality is actually that the Chancellor is, whoever it is, in this case, Healey, is going to have a much longer and bigger impact on any sector, including the life sciences sector, than any other appointment. That said, Patrick Vallance, Minister for Science, announced today that he will be stepping down. And so that is quite a blow because he's really been a big champion. Not often that a whole sector really likes somebody, especially not a minister, but he really was very well appreciated and also did great things in the pandemic, but even since then for the sector itself. So sort of feels like the blows keep coming for UK biotech. We'll see how this one plays out.
So one of the things my understanding is that the new government is making a big effort to try to kind of spread the economic development around and not concentrate it in London and the South. I wonder what impact do you think that'll have? Will it actually be successful?
That's a good question, Steve. I think that it's going to have quite an impact. And I think people point to the Manchester example. It could be very successful. The devil's in the details, though. When I spoke to investors mainly, but also biotech executives, they're like, if you're going to force me to start companies, to do company creation all over the place, that's not viable because there just isn't the infrastructure for it. But if what you're talking about is spreading, giving universities more money for translational research, allowing some areas to become, say, very good in manufacturing, tapping into the regional differences, that could be very impactful and could absolutely be a good thing for the sector. So I think that's absolutely what Burnham said he's going to do. A lot of people look at Manchester as a very good example. I think we all know that being mayor, even of a really big place like Greater Manchester, is not the same as being prime minister.
So one thing that's interesting, quickly, I was talking to the CMO of one of the largest CROs in the world last week, and we were talking about various things. We were talking about the UK, and he said, well, the thing is you have to understand about the UK is that there's two economies there, and that the prices and the costs of doing clinical research in the South there are comparable to what they are in the United States. But in the North, it's much less expensive, Manchester, Leeds, and the capabilities, he was saying, are just as strong as they are in the South of England. They're just as strong as they are in the United States.
100%, 100%. And that, I think it was Kate Bingham actually, and it was like, we'd love that. You can do clinical trials anywhere. So absolutely, if you can create, and that's good for those local economies as well, right? So if you can send things to those areas, one of the issues that Patrick Vallance talked about a lot, as do others, but it was really something that Vallance, and in fact, Lawrence Talon, as CEO of MHRA, the regulator there, have pointed out that a really small percentage of eligible patients end up in clinical trials. I have to be honest, I don't know how that compares with other countries, but I know that in the UK, they feel that as a particularly sore point. So being able to go to those other regions could be very impactful.
Well, of course, it's true in the United States too. Very, very small percentage of patients. And if you look at it particularly in areas where there should be a lot more, for the good of the patients, there should be a lot more clinical trial participation, for example, in cancer. You can argue that anybody who has a cancer that can't be well treated by an FDA-approved therapy should think seriously about being in a clinical trial, and that certainly isn't the case. It doesn't happen anything like that. One other thing is really quickly I want to point out, you mentioned Lawrence Talon. It's one of the strengths of MHRA and one of the strengths, I think, of the UK, that there's no talk of him leaving, right? That he's going to be staying on, because it's not like the FDA where there's an expectation that every time you have a change in government, you have a change in leadership of the regulator.
Right. So 2 or 3 things there, Steve. Number one, I've not heard anything like that, and they would be lunatics to do that. Okay, just lunatics. The Vallance situation is a little bit different for this reason. So I think you pointed out in a previous podcast that the MHRA, sure, it's a government position, but it's not a political one. And so I've not heard anything like that. And I think most people really feel strongly that Talon is doing a good thing. And I don't really think that this is on Andy Burnham's radar. The issue with Patrick Vallance is a little bit different. And I just have to say that there are other people who frankly could fill his shoes. There's Steve Bates at the Office for Life Sciences, who's, I think, chief executive there. I expect Steve Bates at some point to enter government in that kind of a role. Actually, though, the rumors are that, and these are probably well-founded rumors, is that, in fact, they're going to fold the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, that's DSIT. It was only created in 2023, and that's what Patrick Vallance was the head of. The idea is that they might fold that into the Department for Business and Trade. And there are people who say these things should be closer together. You really should couple science with trade if you want to do what a sector wants you to do. Vallance is great. It's always easier to sort of worry about the loss of something when you don't know what it's going to look like in its place. So you just have to say it doesn't have to be a terrible outcome. As with everything, it's really, really the uncertainty that people dislike.
So we talked about these blows that keep coming, but in a positive development, maybe we should mention the second story that you're publishing today, Simone, on the UK, which is about a data resource, a kind of single point of entry for NHS data. I'll just briefly talk about the value in that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing. That's called the HDRS. They're not really into very catchy names, I have to say. I mean, UK Biobank was a better name than this, but HDRS stands for the Health Data Research Service. It's annoying because there's a few other HDR things I have to tell you. So anyway, HDRS is and it's sort of like a UK Biobank on steroids almost. It's called a single front door they want for their UK health data. And the bottom line is that, they really want people to be able to access NHS data, all patient NHS data. That's 68 million patients' longitudinal records, multimodal records. And at the moment, if you want to get hold of that data, you have to apply to each region separately because it's very, very fragmented. And so a big initiative was to create a federated system that would allow you to look across the whole data set. And the reason I bring up the UK Biobank is that we talk to people, Selena, quite a lot who tell us they've used UK Biobank in drug development. And that's been quite fruitful, but that's like 500,000 lives. And here, it's, and I think it's sort of from a single point in time, but here this is just much, much bigger. And so there's certainly, would be nice to see a continuity of that kind of investment in infrastructure and capabilities. So as you point out, that's a slightly rosier story.
Sounds good. Well, we'll drop links in the show notes to Simone's stories. All right. Well, I'm a little jet lagged today, just back from BioAsia Taiwan in Taipei. Reminded me of my Bangkok days, adjusting to the heat and humidity while attempting to wear a suit jacket. Sort of a recipe for disaster, especially when I would walk to my meetings only half a mile, and arrive in just dripping sweat, and they'd say, "Would you like a coffee or water?" And I'm like, "Well, that's kind of clear. I need a glass of water." And they'd serve me a piping hot cup of water. So it took some adjustment, but I'd like to just say hats off to Wallace Lin and his team at Taiwan Bio. The event's been in Taipei since 2019, and this year attracted more than 3,000 attendees from more than 50 countries. Particular focus of Dr. Lin this year was regional collaboration in this year's forum, which was sort of a subset of the overall meeting, nearly doubled in size with representatives from across APAC, all the way to the Netherlands.
So Jeff, you're just fresh back. What can you say about the Taiwanese innovation ecosystem?
Yeah, it's a good call. I mean, they're very, very good at building companies. TSMC on the semiconductor side. There's a lot of capital from Taiwan's families going into biotech, also other sectors. There's great government support for Taiwan's biotech. And the companies that list on the market there's two markets, Taipei and the Taiwan market. Companies can get very strong support from retail investors. Feels a lot like Singapore, Korea. When you're launching, you really need to look beyond Taiwan's borders from the get-go. Look to the US as you're building your company. As I said, the biotech isn't as strong as the tech in Taiwan, but there are a few companies that I'm watching. Pharmacentia is the current market darling. It's a 25-year-old biotech formed when its founders were lured back from the US to plant early seeds of the industry here. Casey Lin is the CEO. He was at Biogen way back when it had 200 people. The chair, Ching Lu Tang, also a returnee. And the company is right now waiting on word from FDA on an expanded label for Besrimi. It will become, if approved in the US, the first new therapy in 30 years for essential thrombocythemia. Another long-standing company that's finding its way back to the public markets is lipid-based platform company TLC Bioscience, which is led by George Ye. The company delisted in Taiwan and from NASDAQ 5 years ago. They're back on the Taiwan market, and they're now looking ahead to back-to-back submissions in the US and Japan for its pain therapies. It's also developing a GLP-1 with reduced dosing frequency for the maintenance setting. Two other companies I'll quickly mention. One, Bora, led by Bobby Sheng, stole the show in terms of deal making when it partnered with Insilico. The company is rapidly expanding via acquisitions in the US, where it does niche and rare indications. Our colleague Karen Tkach-Tusman will have a story on that. coming ahead. And another one, the one younger company in the crowd, Hanker Bio, which has an FC-based designer biologics platform, and they are looking to sail through the headwinds that have sunk other CD47 bets. So that's another one that we'll be watching there.
Well, I think it's really good and really interesting that you're keeping a close eye on Taiwan. I when I was first there in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and I remember at that time it seemed like a backwater. It seemed like, there were people there who were talking about trying to get into tech. There were people talking about trying to get into in computer technology then and into semiconductors and things. And they were people thought, this is a backwater. They're never going to be anything, right? And that was a mistake, right? As you mentioned, they're powerhouses now in semiconductors, and I think it'll be really interesting to see if they can kind of follow through with that same playbook in biotech.
Yeah, I'm certainly impressed that TLC, Pharmacentia, Bora, these are companies that have been around for more than 20 years. So that staying power is impressive. Pharmacentia, the chair told me that one thing that's really different about Taiwan's markets is that it's retail investors, they like their local heroes, and so they'll stick with you even after a setback. They're very, very loyal, and that's one key to success, at least for that company, and those investors are being rewarded now. All right, well, we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to get science-y. We're going to take a look at what's happening with Biogen's Tau program with my fellow executive editor, Selena Koch.
This episode of BioCentury This Week is brought to you by the 13th China Healthcare Summit, taking place November 2nd to 4th in Shanghai. Everyone has an opinion about China Biotech, but there's a difference between reading about cross-border deals and seeing it for yourself. The 13th China Healthcare Summit brings you to Shanghai November 2nd to 4th for a first-hand look at China's innovation moment. Join BioCentury, Bay Helix, and Insights partner McKinsey & Company for a deep dive into China's biopharma ecosystem and meet the biotech leaders who are driving all the news flow. Sourcing innovation, building new co's, generating faster clinical data, reimagining your R&D strategy. For a dozen years, the China Healthcare Summit has gathered the right people to network and build business. Now it's your chance to be in the room. Join us in Shanghai this November. Opt into the tour of Suzhou and a visit to Shanghai Clinical Trial Centers. See it for yourself. Register at biocenturychinasummit.com.
We are back on the BioCentury This Week podcast. Selena, it always gets busy whenever there's a big Alzheimer conference for you. In addition to everything else you do around here, you like to dig into the data.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Well, maybe we should start with why this particular readout mattered. I mean, obviously, Tau's on a new hypothesis. We've seen what feels like failure after failure of Tau therapies in phase 2. That said, it's become apparent in recent years that the level and pattern of Tau accumulation in the brain, as measured on PET imaging, correlates much more closely with the development and the progression and the types of symptoms people get than amyloid ever did, right? So people have high hopes for Tau in general, and this particular candidate stood out in a couple of ways. So Tau is a very complex target. It's one thing that's made it harder than amyloid. Amyloid's basically, you know where it is. It's in the extracellular spaces between neurons. That's where you target it. Tau's different. It exists inside cells. It exists outside cells. It is alternatively spliced. It's in various fragments and lots of different kinds of post-translational modifications. So what that's meant is that the therapies that have come before, they singled out one hypothesis, a particular fragment or modification, et cetera. And they've mostly all been extracellular targeting as well, and hope that, they had their rationale for why that's the primary disease driver, right? But this therapy, diranersen, goes upstream, and it essentially tries to simplify the hypothesis. So it's an antisense oligo made with Ionis that basically lowers the source material that's essential for creating all of those forms of Tau, rather than trying to figure out which one is the important pathological species, when in fact many could be important, right? So people were looking forward to the result for that rationale, and because there was an interesting early result where the therapies that came before either failed to lower the tau PET signal, or what we saw in at least one case was normally the tau aggregation accumulates over time and gets worse, right? And so we saw a slowing of that accumulation. Well, Duranersen actually reversed tau PET, so it was lower than at baseline. So that felt like a breakthrough. So here you have this bigger sort of sledgehammer in a way. And you could say, well, if you just broadly lower tau, can you actually slow cognitive decline or not? Unfortunately, as happens often in Alzheimer's disease, the results are kind of murky. You can look at them in a sort of glass half full or glass half empty way, as people will, and there will be two camps, of course, as there always is in Alzheimer's. So it missed its endpoint, which was trying to establish a dose response on the cognitive measure of the standard one, CDR sum of boxes, clinical dementia rating scale. But yeah, so the lowest dose, 60 milligrams every 24 weeks, performed the best. But then if you look at sort of the absolute changes on that scale and the other cognitive endpoints that they measured in phase 2, there was a 26% slowing on CDR sum of boxes, slowing of progression, which was, and then the other endpoints were actually bigger moves, so 42% slowing on ADAS-Cog13, 50% slowing of progression on the mini mental state exam. So if you just line those up with the approved anti-amyloid antibodies, those results look good, if maybe even a little bit better. And that's kind of the basis on which Biogen's moving forward, and why the study's PIs view this as the long-awaited proof of principle for tau, right? The complexity comes in the fact that the biomarkers sort of move the other way. There was a good dose response for the biomarkers, but not so much for the cognitive endpoints.
Haven't we seen this movie before?
Yeah, so I got to do that as well. So, Selena, why is this field so difficult? And why is it so difficult is one question. But what I'm really asking is that just when Steve says this movie before, I was thinking the same thing. It seems to be that in this field in particular, there's this sort of, well, I like this bit of data, but I don't like that bit of data, but I can
the low dose didn't work, but I mean, the low dose worked better than the high dose, and it missed its endpoint, but
it's still really good, and I'm still going to go forward with it, So we're not asking you to defend them, but can you unravel it a little bit for us?
Well, so like I said, they lined up these results with the approved anti-amyloid therapies and said, look, it appears to be that could change in phase 3. But for what we have today, it appears to be at least as good as them, and they're on the market. And eventually everybody thinks this is probably a combination play, right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask too. Is there any reason to think that it'll be a cumulative effect if you combine them? And would you get, if the results are about the same, would you then, if you combine them, get a doubling of efficacy?
It's unclear yet if it'd be quantitative like that. And the amyloid hypothesis, posits that the amyloid reduction is like a little bit before the tau reduction. But we're talking about a very lengthy disease, and there's a lot of overlap in these pathologies in their development. So yeah, I think probably if they're safe enough to combine, you would in principle expect greater efficacy from combining. And you could think about, you say, oh, it's always the same in Alzheimer's disease, but they would say, yes, but that's also true in cancer. Incremental benefit really matters, and you have to start somewhere, and you have to build on each result, right? So that's the other side of the coin.
When do we find out what happens next?
Right. So the company has decided that it's enough of a signal to move to phase 3. Investors weren't so happy about that. I think company's market cap fell over $2 billion that day. But that might be also a function of, Viehbacher coming in and saying he's going to diversify the company away from some of these high-risk bets. And he has done quite a lot of that. But here they are making another, embarking on a very expensive, long, large phase 3 in a high-risk situation. Anyway, for the sake of science, it will be interesting to see the result. There's no doubt. It's a little complex because when you have it's a little hard to interpret the disconnect. The fact that the biomarkers showed a dose response and the cognitive endpoints didn't. So how do you design your phase 3? It may be that, well, that's just a side effect of the small noisiness of phase 2 and the fact that, Alzheimer's is such a heterogeneous disease and we don't have, we're only in the beginning of narrowing that with biomarkers. But there's another possibility, which would have bigger implications for the whole field of tau, right? Which is that if you're taking this kind of a broader approach to lowering tau of all of its forms, there are other siRNA therapies doing this, there's targeted protein degraders, et cetera. There could be a therapeutic window above which getting rid of more tau isn't better. Tau is an important protein in neurons. It could, in theory, have harms if you get rid of too much of it. So, I guess we'll see how they design the phase 3 in terms of what doses they include, but certainly from an efficacy perspective, that low dose is looking like the most promising bet right now.
Sounds good. Well, staying with neuro, Eli Lilly, not to be denied yet another company that it wants to acquire. It's paying $2.8 billion up front to enter into psychedelics, buying Atibeckley. What did you make of the deal, Selena?
So yeah, the Atibeckley molecule is a psychedelic that is a form of DMT. So it's just behind in the clinic, I guess, another psychedelic, a synthetic form of psilocybin from Compass Pathways. So they're kind of positioned against each other in treatment-resistant depression. Ahead of both of them on the market is a psychedelic adjacent compound, Spravato. It's an S enantiomer of ketamine from Johnson & Johnson. Spravato has kind of paved the commercial path for psychedelic type therapies, which are delivered a very different sort of care model than your standard antidepressant, right? What's different between Spravato and these other two, the Compass and Atibeckley programs, is that Spravato is given fairly frequently, whereas the hope is that they're given not once, twice, maybe 3 times with large gaps in between those doses. And then that would be it, right? So that would be the primary differentiator from the way depression is treated today. Atibeckley has said that it thinks it has a best-in-class therapy. So our colleagues, Stephen Hansen and Tierney Baum, looked into the data to, see what they could find about that. If you compare just the phase 2b results from each, they look broadly similar, really, in terms of the point reduction on the primary endpoint. They weren't that different from each other. And given the, the small differences between the trials, the way they're designed, the differences between them, you can't make conclusions about them being meaningful. They seem relatively similar. Now, Compass, when it went on to phase 3, it has read out multiple phase 3 studies, and the point reductions on the primary endpoint reduced considerably from what they saw in phase 2. Still looks effective, still going to probably be a good addition to the treatment, toolbox, but looking more like your standard antidepressant in terms of magnitude of the benefit. We'll see what happens with the now Lilly program, when it's at that stage.
Okay, it's the 12th acquisition so far this year for Lilly. That brings its total outlay on M&A alone to around $23 billion in upfront payments. Notably, it's one of Lilly's most clinically advanced acquisitions of the year. Mostly it's been buying earlier stage assets and companies. It's Lilly's second major takeout in neurology. As we discussed a couple of months ago, Lilly bought Centessa for $6.3 billion upfront, along with a $1.5 billion CVR, and that brought it into narcolepsy and hypersomnia. All righty, let's head over to Washington. Steve, you had a couple of stories last week. Where do you want to begin?
Well, maybe we can start with Acting FDA Commissioner Kyle Diamantis vowing to abandon Marty Makari's policy by podcast approach and returning to conventional methods for communicating about agency guidance. Interestingly, he actually didn't make that as an official announcement. Diamantis sent a private letter to a member of Congress, Representative Diana DeGette, affirming FDA's commitment to follow its own rules on communicating policy. He did that on July the 2nd in response to a letter that she sent to McCary back in March. And then at a hearing on July the 15th, DeGette disclosed the existence of this letter. The letter hasn't been officially released by anybody yet, though any reporter who cares about it has gotten a copy of it one way or another, including me. And so it raises a lot of questions. You've got, on the one hand, I think a lot of people think, well, this is great. FDA's disavowed these informal means of communicating things through podcasts, through journal articles, through social media statements, which caused a great deal of confusion. On the other hand, they haven't done this in an official way, and they haven't officially walked back all the controversial policies or exactly said which policies are going to be, what companies can rely on. One example, so DeGette asked about 3 specific sets of policies. One of the ones that she asked about was CAR T therapy. So Vinay Prasad, when he was CBRE director, was one of the authors on a journal article that said that FDA basically had moved the goalposts for CAR T, and that going forward it would require demonstrations of superiority over existing treatments, and that it wouldn't allow single-arm trials to support new CAR T therapies approvals. There's a lot of concern about that for a variety of reasons. One of them being that a lot of the CAR Ts are being used to treat very, very rare conditions for which it's really not feasible to conduct your conventional superiority randomized controlled trials for that. So in his response to DeGette, Montes said, that article didn't represent FDA policy, that FDA policy has been spelled out in guidance documents in the past. But if you're a CAR T developer, for example, now, what are you to do? Because there's this article that was published in a peer-reviewed journal that the then CBRE director and the then FDA commissioner said, this is the new policy. This is what FDA is doing. This is what you're going to have the standard going forward. And then you've got news articles. You've got articles in BioCentury. You've got articles in other publications saying, well, Diamandis said that that journal article's actually not policy. The policy hadn't changed from what it was prior to that, but there hasn't been an official statement of this from FDA. So you can see it still raises a lot of confusion. It's very muddy. And there are other examples. There are 2 other examples that DeGette asked Diamandis about, and the responses were similar, saying that what McCary had said, for example, to Megyn Kelly about the agency's plausible mechanism framework didn't reflect policy, and that developers should rely on the draft guidance that FDA has published. But on the other hand, CEOs have told me, I've written stories about it, that FDA doesn't seem to be complying with that guidance, at least in the opinion of some of the CEOs who are trying to develop therapies and say that they've been knocked back when they get to FDA. They think that they qualify for the plausible mechanism framework, and FDA said, no, you don't. The framework is, according to these CEOs, they say the framework is really just for N of 1 therapies or N of a very few therapies, and their applications didn't meet that standard, even though the framework that's been published, the draft guidance on it, and statements from FDA officials very explicitly said it's not limited to N of 1 or N of a very few.
All right, Steve. And another way that FDA has been signaling that things are getting back to normal, AdComs. What's happening there?
Yeah, so under former Commissioner McCary, the agency really dialed back on its use of AdComs, and at the same time, it made a lot of controversial decisions without a lot of accountability or transparency about them. And many of those decisions were either complete response letters or set regulatory setbacks to companies that believed that they had aligned with FDA on development programs, and then FDA's new leadership came in and said no, that those understandings were no longer in effect, and that the companies would have to do quite different things if they wanted to get their products approved. So FDA, under Acting Commissioner Diamandis has said that they're going to be holding advisory committees, more advisory committees. FDA staff have told me that that's going to be the kind of the default pathway going forward to resolve the regulatory controversies that occurred under McCary and Prasad. And I think that there's a lot of kind of relief among the companies and the patient groups that there's going to be another look at these things, that there's going to be accountability, and that hopefully the FDA will be getting independent scientific judgments on these controversies. The signals that FDA has sent about this so far are a little bit mixed, right? Because one of the first advisory committees that's going to come up is going to be looking at whether FDA should allow bulk compounding of unproven peptides. And that's, we've talked about that on the podcast before. I've written about it. We've written some commentaries about it. It's a really concerning thing to a lot of people in the public health community, a lot of people in the biopharma world. So good news, right? They're going to have an advisory committee about it. Concerning news, that advisory committee has been packed. They've got new members that have been added to it. Many of the new members who have been added to it have financial stakes in the peptide industry. They're people who work at, who own clinics that administer peptides. They're people who have made their living prescribing peptides. They've commented favorably about these untested peptides on social media. On the other hand, we do have a change from what was happening under McCary, because FDA staff have been allowed, maybe even encouraged, to present their views on this. And the review memos that FDA staff have written and that have been released publicly reinforce the agency's prior position that these peptides haven't been tested. There isn't enough known about their efficacy and safety to allow them to be compounded in bulk. And in fact, for some of them, they're concerning safety signals. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. The other thing that's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out is an advisory committee meeting that's going to be coming up about Replimune's RP1.
Yeah, see, there's been a lot of noise around this. What are you expecting?
So I don't know what's going to happen, but one of the things that's interesting is that the RP1 BLA is not going to be going to the ODAC, to the Oncologic Drugs Advisory Committee, which is what you would have expected. It's going to the Cell Therapy Advisory Committee. It is a cell therapy, but in the past, cell therapies, gene therapies, products, CAR-Ts, things like that involve cancer have gone to ODAC, not to the Cell Therapy Committee. So that's unusual. I think that what's going to be really critical is going to be to see who exactly is on that committee. The committee rosters are depleted for all the advisory committees because they hadn't been holding very many committee meetings under McCary. Membership lapsed, and there weren't new permanent members appointed for a lot of those committees. So there are a lot of open positions. I think the key thing that everybody's going to have to look at are two things for that Replimune Advisory Committee meeting. One, what kind of expertise is put on as temporary voting members to the committee? And then what are the FDA presentations like?
Steve, because one thing I've been curious about is talk about as a return to normalcy. In some ways, we'll never revert to an FDA that's led by Richard Pazder, Peter Marks, so on and so forth. So if you look ahead, though, how much change for the better, or just change in general, might you expect before there's more like permanent leadership?
Well, so look, you can't step into the same river twice, right? FDA is not going to return to where it was before January 2025. Too many people have left, too many things have happened for that to be the case. I think what's going to be really critical is to see who the next commissioner is, who the permanent center directors are, who's going to be made permanent center director at CDER, who's going to be made permanent center director at CBRE, and what do they do to try, if anything, to try to restore FDA's scientific integrity, its independence from political and ideological influence, and then what do they do to bulk up or to bolster, if anything, the whole process for advisory committees? Because it's not like the advisory committee process was perfect before January 2025. There were a lot of problems with it. I've written a great deal about some of those problems and recommendations for how to fix it. But the issues with Replimune and also with the peptides, point out I think one of the fundamental flaws about the advisory committee, which is that you can look at it as kind of an adversarial process. Maybe it's too simplistic, but it's a bit like a trial, right? And you've got FDA presenting one point of view, you've got the sponsor presenting another point of view, and you've got the advisory committee looking at it basically as if they're a jury, right? But in this case, the prosecution, FDA, gets to pick the jury. And I've spoken with senior officials at FDA, some of them still there, some of them who've left, and they openly acknowledged that they picked people for advisory committees who would give them the results that they thought that were the right results. They had their finger on the scale when they were picking people for the committees. And then there's a great deal of concern, and there has been concern expressed again by former senior FDA officials, Janet Woodcock and others, that the rules around conflict of interest have made it impossible in many cases to appoint members of advisory committees who have the requisite or the necessary expertise. And that's particularly acute when it comes to rare diseases, because there are rare diseases and very rare diseases where the only people who are really experts, who would really be qualified to serve on advisory committees, are precluded under the current rules unless there's a waiver, which FDA is reluctant to give, because they've all conducted clinical trials that were sponsored by companies that are developing drugs for those conditions.
All right, thanks for that, Steve. I'll drop links in the show notes to your stories along with Slim's Biogen story. Thank you for tuning in. If you're hungry for more BioCentury's podcasts, tune in later this week. We'll have VC Jessica Owens in conversation with our very own Lindsay Martin on the BioCentury Show. We'll be back next Monday with the next edition of the BioCentury This Week podcast.
BioCentury would like to thank CBRE for supporting the BioCentury This Week podcast. To learn more about how CBRE's unmatched expertise, resources, and connections empower life sciences companies, visit cbre.com/life sciences.